the reason why they don't give us discretion on these things is because too many times women who are at risk want to go back to their abuser. They just wanted him to stop, and they don't want to have to be separated. They don't want him charged. They don't want him to go to jail, and then they end up getting worse and worse treatment, and then they end up getting killed.
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. I do think the title image is a little bit misleading, and I only figured this out watching more and more of the body cam 2 footage from the other officer. So what emerges here, first of all, is what looks like serious duping delight deluxe from Brian. But then later on he really does seem to redeem himself, and I know a lot of people probably don't want to hear this. You probably want to see how Gabby appears to be blameless and Brian appears to be completely to blame. But when you deal with the full context, you really get a sense, I thought, of the officer going to a lot of effort to figure out what's going on. You know, they spend a lot of time trying to understand both these individuals, and I think the point is that they are a little bit difficult to understand. And I think even now, where we are standing with Brian a fugitive, we've kind of got a sense of who is this guy, who is this person that we're dealing with, and also who was Gabby, what kind of person was she, why was she so fragile. But whatever we may say about the Moab incident, one thing that I do think you can't get away from, even if you do give Brian a little bit of credit for something we're going to deal with in this episode, is the fact that Gabby is crying and in a lot of kind of anguish, and Brian seems totally nonchalant, totally happy, totally joking around. What's that all about?
Are you sure you want to hear this?
Before we get started with today's episode, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. Like, share, leave a comment. To subscribe, you can click on the light blue icon on the bottom right of your screen. And let's get started.
And you do have injury, and both an independent witness, probably the next one we're going to talk to as well, which we haven't talked to yet, but the one we did talk to, and your own companion have made it clear that she was the primary aggressor and that she was striking you and that you received injuries. You haven't admitted to striking her. She has not admitted to you striking her. The witness did not see you strike her. So at this point, you're the victim of a domestic assault.
So what I want to do now is review what we've just gone through, but this time I'm going to be reading the transcript to you guys, and we're going to be going through it a little bit in a staggered fashion, a little bit more step by step. And as you're going to see, and I'm sure you've also realized this, things are a little bit more nuanced, a little less black and white as they might seem. So for starters, you have this shocking moment at about 21:55 where the officer says, basically, you're the victim, right? And it just, if you take that out of context, it is fairly shocking that is what they came up with. But there is also a period in the body cam where the officer actually tries to get them both out of the situation, right? He feels like he actually says the spirit of the law is being lost on this one. And it's a kind of a cruel irony that actually the spirit of the law needed to act on that particular incident. So if we go to 21 minutes, 22 seconds of the transcript, the officer says, and it sounds like you guys were living together. Brian doesn't say anything. He's very quiet, and in fact, so is Gabby. The officers by far do the most talking, and both of them are fairly reticent. Would you agree? And so he goes on to say, explaining the law to Brian, he says, so you meet the statute for domestic partners. And then the officer stretches out his hand towards Brian's face. He says, you do have injury. And off an independent witness, and there's another witness we didn't talk to, but the one we did talk to and your companion have made it clear that she was the primary aggressor and that she was striking you and that you received injuries. You haven't admitted to striking her. And at this point, Brian seems to glance nervously around, and he goes on to say, she hasn't admitted to you striking her. And then the witness did not see you strike her. This is a reference to the second witness. So at this point, you're the victim of domestic assault. Brian then looks towards the other officer, says something inaudible, and then forces a laugh and says something like, right. The officer then says, so even if you don't want to pursue this, we don't have a choice. And then at this point, Brian glances down and twiddles his fingers. I think he's basically feeling that he doesn't want to be in this situation. I don't know who would, right? You sort of feel like I'm caught up in sort of red tape kind of thing. The other thing I want to sort of bring up is I think you kind of have a situation here that is, I don't want to say mutually destructive, but the one argument is that the one witness saw Brian hitting Gabby and the other witness saw something else, Gabby hitting Brian. And so I don't know whether that neutralizes the situation. I would think not. I would think it doesn't really matter if, and of course this may not be the law in Utah, but it doesn't really matter what the female did. It matters what the male did. And in this whole story, there's a sort of a contrivance that Brian never hit Gabby. But didn't he? The other witness that they didn't speak to said that he did see something like that. Brian hitting Gabby, Brian slapping her, right? And so I think in that situation, that would trump what she did to him. And then you'd have a situation. I really don't know whether you can have double domestic assault. I think there's always got to be a victim and a perpetrator. And you might want to stop there and say, you know, the onus is on Brian, the responsibility is on Brian. But then you go a bit further. The officer goes on to say, the law says we have to charge her. It doesn't say we have to put her in jail. Brian nods. The officer says, but it also says we have to separate you and a no-contact order, and we have to put her in jail if we cannot separate you. Brian still remains silent but glances quickly towards the van. Now, it's easy to look at this as him kind of manipulating them by not saying something, but he actually seems to be contemplating the situation, trying to figure out the situation. The officer goes on to say, but there's a little problem here because you're from Florida living in the van together. Brian listens while leaning against the side of the van, his head tilted quizzically toward the right. The officer says, how are we supposed to separate you guys? And that is when Brian says this, at 22 minutes, 46 seconds.
Hey, tomorrow, if you want to, it's up to you. You can
Go to jail?
Did you pick that up? Brian said, can I go to jail? And he's smiling. And that's not duping delight. That is Brian actually making a gesture. The officer says, you can't because we don't have a charge for you. Well, there could have been. Even so, I think it's an important point. Brian's smiling broadly, but he is actually being very self-deprecating, right? It's actually quite a good gesture. And regardless of what has gone on before, whose fault it was, what he did to her, this is something that does redeem him, certainly at this point in the narrative. You know, if you don't count what happens after this is something that I found quite surprising. And so what I think it shows is that Brian isn't all bad, even at this relatively late point in the Moab incident. Regardless of him not admitting what he did, he does volunteer to pay the penalty. You could say, well, he should have anyway or whatever, but he does volunteer to pay the penalty from the perspective of, on Gabby's behalf, from the perspective of what the police want to happen in the situation. Unless what's happening is he's simply clarifying that he's off the hook, effectively saying, I can't or I won't go to jail, will I? But I don't know about you, but that's not what I think he means. I think he means to pay the piper for what's happened. You know, he's going to do that. He's prepared to do that. And I think that is commendable. We might not like to admit that. We might not like to say that. But I think that is reality. So how do we link good guy Brian in this particular moment to the Merry Piglet's bad boy? And I think that question in itself is more important than the answer. I think that question brings into reality and puts into sharp contrast two different Brians. A few moments later, Officer Robbins says, "Because you did nothing wrong." And Brian cracks another joke, saying something like, "Take your radio up," or "I'll take your radio," almost as if you're saying, if I do that, maybe you can say I've done something wrong, and then I'll go to jail, kind of thing, instead of Gabby. What do you think he's trying to say? At 29 minutes, there's another interesting insight. A third officer asks Brian if he can afford a hotel, and Brian responds wistfully,
No?
Very little money we have for sure.
Hotels are expensive.
So if you heard that, he said, "We have very little money right now for sure," or something like that. I do think it's odd that the officers on scene don't deal at all with what one of the officers witnessed firsthand: Brian speeding and seemingly driving away regardless of the fact that a cop car was in pursuit. To me, in a way, that is the most serious offense of everything. If you say, well, what happened between Brian and Gabby was, like harmless child fighting and slapping. Personally, I don't think it was that harmless given what ultimately happened. But on the scale of, where we are right now, and maybe it's easy to say in hindsight, but isn't that exactly what Brian is doing right now? He is a fugitive from justice. And wasn't something like that playing out then? And if he didn't get away with it then, if he had actually spent time in jail, if there was a situation like that pending, couldn't it have prevented the outcome? And I think this is what a lot of people are talking about. That if the Moab incident was handled differently, Gabby would still be with us. The other thing, and I think it's the most powerful insight from this second body cam, is if you just acknowledge the fact that because you get to see Brian via the officer coming from the left-hand side, the driver's side of the vehicle, and you get that impression of him. And so what you see effectively is Brian seeming to switch from the Tyler Durden in front of the Moonflower Co-op, and whatever caused both of these witnesses to call law enforcement, that Tyler Durden version of Brian Laundrie changes into this ineffectual Jack in the blink of an eye. What is that showing us? Two Brians. What exactly does that mean? Well, I'll be dealing with that in more detail, dealing with the psychological life of Brian, so look out for that. We'll be dipping into more of Ernest Becker's astonishing analysis on the science of man, so we will be getting to that. So, as I said, I'm not going to take it further than that. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.